job. Now, good news for farmers and the environment. The federal government has banned the use of the dangerous pesticide Endosulfan. And joining us on the line right now to chat about the news is the coordinator of the National Toxics Network, Jo Imming. Welcome, Jo. How are you going?
Good, thank you.
That's good. Now, Jo, can you just let us know what are the dangers of people that come into contact, firstly, with Endosulfan?
Well, Endosulfan is an organochlorine pesticide which shares many of the same characteristics as DDT, which people may be more familiar with. So it's a chemical that builds up in your body, unfortunately, and persists. And it's also now been implicated as a hormone-disrupting chemical in very, very small amounts. So it is toxic, and it's also extremely toxic to the environment.
Okay, so when you say it's toxic to people over time, is that the people working with the chemicals, or does it come back to consumers somehow?
It's really with respect to everybody. Certainly people who are working with it are at much greater risk of being exposed to larger doses of it. You know, people mixing chemicals or farmers applying it. But if you're living in an area where it's being used, you're also going to be being exposed to residues. And it's possible that consumers through some food produce are being exposed to residues as well, although that's certainly less of a risk.
Yeah, Jo, without sort of making a judgment sitting here on Endosulfan, I've had a fair bit of experience with it over time, but we do seem to be somewhat out of step with New Zealand and overseas countries with the use of it.
We certainly do. In fact, 70 other countries have already banned Endosulfan before Australia made the announcement on Tuesday. And I think that says a lot. It was Canada and the US and New Zealand, as you mentioned, had already taken that decision based on scientific evidence that was before them that the chemical was just too toxic and couldn't be risk managed anymore without causing adverse health and environmental impacts.
So why do you think Australia was so slow in picking up the ban?
It's a good question. I have my take on it. I think our regulator in Australia is a captured agency. It's funded entirely through industry cost recovery funds. I think they're very much geared towards being very efficient for industry, but I don't think they're necessarily being very efficient towards ensuring the protection of the environment and community health. Many of their chemical reviews, for example, have been going on for over 10 years.
Yeah, I was a bit surprised yesterday. I heard a bit of a debate on this on one of the news radio stations, and they were saying that there was no need to because it wasn't an occupational health and safety problem in Australia, which that may be debatable anyway, but that seemed to ignore the bigger picture.
Yeah, I agree with you. I do think it is debatable because the US EPA certainly made its decision based on risks that it calculated for users of the chemical. So despite the APVMA saying, you know, it had already accounted for that, I don't necessarily follow that logic. But I also think certainly the downplaying of the environmental impacts really disturbs me as well, because that's where we're seeing some of the biggest build-ups of Endosulfan. You know, the Endosulfan that we use in Australia, for instance, ends up in krill in the Antarctic that whales are eating. That's the kind of global transportation that's going on with this chemical. So there's serious impacts, and we also measure it in women's breast milk and blood from cords for newborn babies. So really it's getting everywhere, and that's totally unacceptable, and it's a shame it took them so long to figure that out.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the environmental impacts? Because that sounds pretty insane, getting into whales in the Antarctic Ocean from what they said was safe originally, I guess.
Well, it's quite incredible. It's been measured in so many different places, in tree bark, for instance, and snow and rainfall, in air samples. So it's unfortunately one of those chemicals that's highly volatile. It lifts off the area where it's been used, and it moves around in the environment. And because of its persistent nature, when it even, I think they started measuring it, looking at the different breakdown metabolites, and I think they got a very different picture then. So sometimes it depends what you're looking for in the environment as to what you find. And unfortunately it persists and it bioaccumulates, which means it's things higher up in the food chain are getting more of it.
Yeah, and Jo, you'd be showing some interest at the moment in the extent of the locust campaign and the amount of spraying that goes on there. I know the authorities are very sort of careful about the way they operate, and we would hope that everyone spraying on a smaller scale will sort of likewise sort of do absolutely the right thing.
That's right. The locusts are a real concern, obviously, and I certainly don't want to downplay any of the significance of the current locust situation. But it does concern me that there's going to be huge and extensive use of organophosphate pesticides in particular and other nerve poisons to treat the locusts. And certainly it's concerning, you know, when we're talking about people losing crops and so on. But I do think we need to also consider the broader impacts to the environment. There are many native birds and insects, for example, that will also be affected by these sprays. And locusts, after all, are a native species.
Mm. Yeah.
It is a hard one.
As hard as it is to consider that, it is part of the equation that, you know, we've come out of a drought and we've had a boom year with rain and so on, and it's a natural occurrence. As I said, I'm not trying to downplay it because I know it's a massive problem that farmers are confronting. But, you know, there are other chemicals, for example, that are less toxic. So you know, maybe we need in the future to look towards much more use of the biological-based pesticides that are available, such as the metarhizium fungal insecticide that is being used in this current campaign. But there is also other products that are registered in other countries that aren't registered here. For example, neem, which is highly effective against grasshoppers.
Right.
Yeah. Rest assured, Joe, that there have been changes over the years in the way that locust campaigns are operated, and certainly the fact that now they're trying to spray them before they hit the wing is a lot better than chasing them throughout other areas. It gives them a lot more sort of control over what's actually done. So hopefully we'll get through what's going to be a huge campaign without too many problems.
Yeah. I think you're right. There's been a lot of really good coordination and communication from what I hear. And I've certainly been speaking to people in the organic industry who was initially, you know, really concerned about the impacts to them, and they're very pleased so far with the high level of organisation between all the different agencies, and they're thinking that it's going to go very well. So that's encouraging to hear.
Very much so. Well, thank you very much for your time today, Joe. It's been great finding out some of the finer details about the ban of the endosulfan.
Thank you very much for having me on the program.
All right, that was an interesting one. Locusts.
Yeah, sort of. You know, and it's not lost on anyone that we've got to be careful. You know, it's sort of around built-up areas where there's housing, near waterways, and the department are very conscious of that. And certainly, the education of farmers is sort of pretty thorough on that as well by both the departments and the resellers. And farmers have got a pretty good understanding nowadays because chemicals are a part of daily life for them. So they're very careful. They sort of understand that they've got the privilege of using them. Misuse leads to other problems.
Definitely so. Well, we've got plenty